but he no longer has available the ability to borrow from the future to make up for the shortfall in his cost of in the cost of maintaining a constant standard of living. So there's no way we're going to see a rapid turnaround in this economy. That's at one side. I mean, it's one reason that we're in a protracted downturn. One reason it's actually beginning to get worse at this point. The other side is that Lyndon Johnson, who is a great manipulator of the data, and his administration, they worked out the current reporting of the budget deficit on a cash basis, cash in, cash out, or the Social Security system up until this year had actually been generating a cash surplus. More was being paid in than was being paid out. Supposedly, these funds being built up and held for future Social Security payments. But that they were counted as part of the general fund, so that the surplus in Social Security offset some of the deficit in the other general accounts and made the deficit look better.
Isn't that an accounting fraud?
Yeah, but the federal government's been doing it, and it was approved by Congress. And it's not the first time they've done something that is counter to what you might do in the private sector. And then along came what were then the Big Ten accounting firms in the 70s, and they said, "Hey, U.S. government, you're running the largest business on earth. You should have an accounting system that's the same as used by large corporations. Use generally accepted accounting principles." And after 30 years, they finally started publishing official, generally accepted accounting principle statements, although there was argument over whether or not they should show the annual deterioration in the unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare on a net present value basis. They put it in a footnote. They don't add it into the statement. They should be adding it into the statement the same way General Motors used to before it went under.
Please explain what an unfunded liability is so people can be with you on the same page.
Well, it's in other words, the government commits to spending money, but it doesn't. It hasn't at the same time put in place a mechanism to pay for it or to fully pay for it, so that over time, the liability, say in Social Security or Medicare, is going to grow, but the taxes, the payroll taxes that would cover that, or whatever has to be done in terms of retirement age, is not adjusted, so that the funds that will be covering it fall way short of what's going to be paid out.
So the government's taken on obligations for the future that it can't deliver on.
Absolutely. And in fact, the most egregious element of this, and this is when I first started writing about hyperinflation, took place in 2004. The government revamped the Medicare program, put in prescription drugs. That package alone added roughly $8 trillion of unfunded liabilities to the government's balance sheet. And at that time, the total federal debt was about $8 trillion, effectively doubled the government's obligations at that point in time. Now, they've been playing games with the reporting here, but generally what you're seeing is that the actual deficit, including how much deterioration we're seeing in those unfunded liabilities each year. And again, the net present value brings it into current dollar terms. How much money do you need in hand today to cover that obligation down the road? We're seeing an actual deficit in the range of $4 to $5 trillion.
Is that per year?
Per year, yes, annual deficit. That's what can't be covered. I mean, you could take 100% of people's income and corporate profits in taxes. You'd still be in deficit. You could cut every penny of government spending except for Social Security and Medicare, and you'd still be in deficit. It's uncontainable, and it's certainly not sustainable. That's what people have been talking about. Gave us all this big debate in Washington, and Washington showed they did not have the political will to even consider meaningfully addressing the problem here. They don't have the government does not have the ability to pay the obligations that it has already taken on, and that it is still taking on. Those obligations continue to increase. Now, most countries in that type of a position historically have done a very simple thing, and that is when they get to the point that they can no longer raise adequate funds and taxes, they print the money. And you end up with a hyperinflation and the currency collapses.
And we're going to talk about that because there's a lot of confusion about what hyperinflation is, printing money, M3, and how the money supply has to do with inflation.
Indeed, there are a number of issues there, but in terms of the collapse, we got to a point, but the debt system was collapsing. And in many areas it actually did collapse. In August of 2008, September, that time frame with the failure of Lehman Brothers, a run on the banking system started, and when those hollering for help, saying, "Oh, we've got to put forth a big stimulus package here. We're going to see a collapse of the banking system, and it'll go, into a Great Depression next week if we don't." They weren't kidding. The system was on the brink of collapse. Now, we shouldn't have gotten to that point, but we did, having gotten there. The Fed was in a position, and the Fed ostensibly is there to keep inflation under control and maintain sustainable economic growth. That's fine on the periphery, but their primary function is to maintain the solvency of the banking system. It's a private entity. It's owned by the commercial banking interest or those related to it. The Fed was not going to let the system collapse, and neither was the federal government. This is absolute failure in terms of the government and the Fed if it happened. So what they did was they spent whatever money they had to create. They made whatever guarantees they had to do to keep the system from crashing. And it was not just the U.S., it was on a global basis. The Fed can create an infinite amount of money, and they showed their colors at that time. And that was, they were not going to let the system collapse. There's a cost to what they did, and that's inflation.
But when you say the system, John, you're really talking about the banking system, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Basically, the banking system, if the banking system collapses, that's your flow of money and credit. The flow of credit has not returned. People still are able to get their money out of banks. That's the difference with what happened in the 30s. In the 30s, you had a banking system collapse. Many banks went out of business. And when those banks went out of business, the depositors lost all their money. There was no FDIC to give you your money back. So that at that time, that there you had a grand contraction of the money supply, and you had the money supply contracted by about a third, and you saw a deflation that would be measured at roughly the same magnitude. That's something that Mr. Bernanke has sworn to not allow happen.
I was under the impression that a great deal of the bailout went to credit default swaps and banks directly in derivative instruments.
Yeah. Well, it was spread where it was needed to prevent the collapse. All sorts of things. AIG, you wouldn't think wouldn't come to you off the top of your head as something that you would have seen threatening this, but they had the exposure on the credit default swaps, and they were effectively bankrupt with what they had taken. If they failed, the banks that had the credit default swaps behind their instruments would have failed.
Are we on the Titanic with respect to really embracing that Medicare and Social Security will not be here in 10 years or less?
Well, if what I think is going to happen here is within that time frame, you're going to see, I think we're on the brink of another threatened systemic collapse. And I would not be at all surprised to see some extraordinary actions from the Fed and even from the federal government, despite all the political rancor that you have there.
How would that manifest itself? Give us an example.
For example, you just had a large bank that had an infusion of capital from a very wealthy individual. That wouldn't have happened if the bank were not having some capital problems. The banking system basically is having ongoing solvency problems. That's why you're not seeing meaningful bank lending, meaningful growth in bank lending. The banks have impaired balance sheets. They say, "Oh yeah, we can't. We're looking for credit-worthy people to lend the money to, but we can't find them." That's nonsense. There are a lot of credit-worthy people out there, and there's an element of that. But the big problem is that the banking system is not functioning normally because they're largely insolvent. Everything the Fed has done has not solved that problem. everything the Fed and the